Good evening. This is Mae Brussell. The title of this program is World Watchers. It's broadcast number 725, November the 4th, 1985. I hope that most of you take this off the air, that hear it on other radio stations, and many of you know, and some of you don't, that you can write to me, send a self-addressed stamped envelope, that's May, and the Brussels is like Brussels sprouts, to P.O. Box 22511, Carmel 93922, and request information how you can get back tapes that are available on the various subjects that I cover, and also you may get bibliography sheets that accompany these broadcasts. If you want to write once a month or send self-addressed stamped envelopes and have me fill them monthly, indicate on the envelope what it's for, because I can't separate all the mail and figure this out. There's too much mail. But if you want the month of October or September, 22-cent stamp holds 4 sheets that's printed on both sides of information and sources of data where you can obtain these articles or books that I refer to on the air. November is the anniversary, November 22nd, 1963, of the murder of John Kennedy. I've been doing my research for 22 years, and every subject that I choose to describe on these broadcasts for the past 15 years relates back some way to the people who either murdered John Kennedy or covered up the murder. And what I detailed many times when I'm not specifically talking about the Kennedy assassination is the way that political assassinations are done and how he was one among many for the same motives and purposes that they're continuing to be done today. So you can send for information about these broadcasts. Also on broadcast number 725, this was just last week, October 28th, I ran down a tremendously large number of names for you that involved the Nazis, the neo-Nazis, drug dealers, gun running, connections to the Vatican, to our own intelligence community and our Justice Department. It was an overview. I didn't expect you to remember all of those names, but I wanted to show you articles that are coming out in the newspapers in the past 2 weeks that link so many disparate units that are apparently not related to connections that I've been sharing with you the past years, and particularly the last year, all being exposed, parts of these links, through court trials in Palermo, Italy, in New York City, arrests up in Vancouver, an arrest in Phoenix, Arizona, drug dealers from San Diego, and trying to show you how much is in the news now that is literally gushing out that does have a central focus point that I've been talking about for a long time. Now, because I gave so many names and connections last week, it's really too fast to remember all of those various people. Next week, I'm going to go over it again, update what I said with you, and review 725 because it was done as an overview in a hurry and try to detail it for you. Granted, it could be very confusing to have so many names thrown out, but once in a while, that has to be done, just as you go to a stockbroker and you see across the screens there certain stocks that are up or down or lost or gained or mergers. And if you don't know the companies and the people and you first walk into there or visit Wall Street, it is overwhelming to get so much information. You have to become a student of these things to know that every single one of those numbers is up there for a code, for a reason, and people's fortunes are made or broken on quick decisions, and I believe our lives are made or destroyed by these people who haven't been exposed enough, and there's never enough time to do in detail some of them. So, as I say, that was an overview. Now, this week, I'm just going to talk about Dan White, the role he had in San Francisco murdering a member of the Board of Supervisors and the mayor, and the politics of San Francisco and the situation of Dan White, the person, as another example of a political zombie that could be used for purposes that did in fact work. William Buckley, who is no stranger to conspiracies, he worked in the Central Intelligence Agency with E. Howard Hunt, and he was in the CIA there. He started National Review, the magazine, in 1955, and the lawyer who did the corporation papers for him was William Casey, formerly of the OSS, a Knight of Malta from the Vatican, as is Buckley, and now director of the CIA. He set up the corporations for Buckley for his magazine National Review. And in 1970, Buckley came out with a book he first wrote earlier and then updated called The Government Listless, sounds like you're lisping, Listeth, the government listeth, published by Putnam. And I just want to begin the Dan White story by giving you some quotations from William Buckley in this particular book, reprinted from an article he did in Esquire magazine called The Politics of Assassination, and then apply this also to the Dan White story. He wrote in October 1968 that Robert Kennedy had a way of saying things loosely and in generalities. Of course, Robert Kennedy was dead in June 1968, and Buckley gets the last word. He writes this in October. He said that Robert Kennedy, in April 1968, April 5th, exactly 2 months to the date that he himself would be dead in June, he makes note of that, 2 months exactly, said, "What has violence ever accomplished?" Robert Kennedy asked, and he says, "What has it created?" And he says, "No martyr's cause has ever been stilled by an assassin's bullet." And William Buckley, partner with E. Howard Hunt, Hunt was one of the Watergate defendants with Frank Sturgis, associate of Lee Harvey Oswald in intelligence, and the team of Assassination Incorporated literally is taking issue with, Buckley is taking issue about this question of Robert Kennedy. Buckley also founded Young Americans for Freedom with Mr. Douglas Caddy, and they brought over 19 people from Munich, Germany, that had a role in the murder of John Kennedy in Dallas, Texas, to divert the newspaper ads written by the Birch Society to make it look like a Jew was involved in the murder of Kennedy. So he takes issue, Buckley, with Robert Kennedy's statement shortly before he died that this never stops a cause. And he brings out the fact that the assassination of George Lincoln Rockwell put an end to the American Nazi Party, which was most clearly a cause. What Buckley doesn't say is that Rockwell worked for him for 2 years, and then when Rockwell was murdered, the American Nazi Party simply changed its name to the National Socialist Party, and William Pierce, who worked for Pratt & Whitney, United Technology, who was the editor of the National Socialist World, took over the role of Rockwell when Rockwell was murdered. And I'll do more about that next week on Rockwell, E. Howard Hunt, and William Buckley. But he goes on and he says the assassination of Imre Nagy and his followers settled that problem, and he doesn't even say who Imre Nagy is. He died in Hungary. He was killed in Hungary, and his brother was part of Permendex's organization that worked with Clay Shaw and was in Dallas, Texas at the time John Kennedy was murdered, and played a role with Permendex, and he just passes that off, that a problem was solved by the murder of Nagy. That brought in more fascism into Dallas, Texas, along with the killing of a president of the United States. So now we have the Nazi Party becoming more powerful with William Pierce, bringing in the Defense Department because Pierce worked for the Air Force, and Pratt Whitney was a physicist with a PhD and a professor. So when the little bunklings get their organizations lopped off, the next group gets more powerful. Then he goes on, the assassination of Malcolm X accompanied the liquidation of the competition to Elijah Muhammad's hegemony. Well, that brought in Louis Farrakhan. So things get tougher and meaner, but the assassination achieves a role, and it always brings these organizations farther to the right than they were when it started. He goes into the assassination of Huey Long, accomplished the termination of a political threat to Franklin Roosevelt, but then there were plans to kill Roosevelt and get him out to make sure that atomic bomb Harry Truman and General Eisenhower with Richard Nixon under him go farther right. He said the assassination of Trujillo accomplished the reintroduction of democracy to the Dominican Republic, meaning the Gulf and Western took over, the corporations took over, and there hasn't really been a great democracy there. He cites these various assassinations. He says the civil rights assassination in the South, beginning with William Moore, the mailman in 1963, and ending with the death of Martin Luther King 5 years later, created an encyclopedia of civil rights legislation. The blacks now have more unemployment, more drugs, less opportunity to get into the mainstream, and the black mayors in Los Angeles, Detroit, and Philadelphia are being discredited with violence, with burnings, with Farrakhan splitting the party there and turning the Jews against the mayor. The assassination of Martin Luther King has brought more fundamentalists of power, with their racism into power the John Singlaubs and the death squads and so forth than ever before. And then he said the whole world is suffering, most of all the United States, from Kennedy's assassination, which introduced a rigidity to Americans' Far Eastern policy. And this is William Buckley covering that up. But the point is, he's trying to say that the assassinations made some change, but actually working on the inner team with the CIA, he knows that each one of these murders brought things tougher to the right, as they did in San Francisco, even though the gays are more prominent. People like Pat Robertson made $22 million with tax deductions last year, and the religious right and the Jerry Falwell now are ready to slam down on the gays, and they have produced an AIDS which will eliminate a lot of the problems that the gay movement thought they had in their hands in terms of getting a political vote, even on the Board of Supervisors way back when Harvey Milk was killed. And then finally he says the assassination of Robert Kennedy assured the nomination of Hubert Humphrey. Well, so what? As soon as Robert Kennedy was killed, all the upper echelon went to work for Howard Hughes, the right wing, the hidden, I call it the umbrella Gestapo of the United States, with Robert Mayhew and his teams that had hired John Rosselli and Sam Giancana, that embarrassed the Kennedys, that played a role in the Kennedy murders. And so Buckley is saying that assassinations, they do not accomplish, many times do not accomplish anything. And then he says, but sometimes they really do. And one has to consider the politics of assassination, Buckley says, because in an age of totalism, assassination is an instrument of policy. It is no less so because some assassinations bring back consequences different from those desired by the assassin. But in this case, everything the assassin wanted in each one of these murders brought around exactly what they wanted, and the politics of assassinations is, in an age of totalism where things are going to be totally controlled, is very important. And then Buckley says it may be that the politics of assassination will end up doing exactly what it wanted, changing American democracy. That was written after John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, and Martin Luther King were murdered, and Malcolm X and Medgar Evers, and they will change American democracy, and Dan White is a part of that, and the San Francisco scene. Use them in the past tense, but Dan White still lives, just like Evita Peron lives. Now, there was an article in a newspaper in the San Francisco area, San Francisco Progressive, sent by a friend from World Watchers, and it's an article by Kathleen Baca on the response of people in San Francisco to hearing that Dan White died and commit suicide. And they quoted a person who corresponds and sends me material and gets tapes of the broadcast, Paul Bernardino, of the Committee to Stop the Moral Majority in Fascism that he has in the Bay Area. And he said he wouldn't believe Dan White was dead unless he saw the body. The sheet was over him, and it was taken away. He said, I'll tell you who let White down, he said. It was the corporations. They set him up to kill George Moscone and Harvey Milk, and then they let him out to dry. It's all right here, he said, holding up tape cassettes of Mae Brussell, political researcher and author. The tapes he is selling for $5 profile the life of Harvey Milk and Dan White and include the confession of Dan White in which he admits to being set up. Now, he's referring to tapes I made several years ago. This was 1978. The years go by so fast. 7 years ago. And I'm very proud of the accuracy of my research. I always am when I look back at the timing and date, because nobody in the United States then or now is addressing themselves to the issues of Dan White in San Francisco, and I was proud that Paul Bernardino brought attention to this. David Emery and Nip Tuck are doing it now with their programs, but Paul took out the early broadcasts and gave credit to the work that I was doing then as well as what I'm doing now. Now, December 29th, 1978, that was just weeks after the shooting of the two men in the City Hall, I did a broadcast simultaneously on Jonestown and Dan White. And this is what I had about Dan White and the murder of Harvey Milk and George Moscone. I said, first, Dan White is a zombie with no emotions or reactions. That was written 7 years ago. When he was on parole, when he was at Soledad, all the years anyone saw him, the priest or the family parole officer, It was exactly that. He was out of it. No emotions, no reactions in all that time. 2, White was gone 2 years, and he turned into a sleeper killer. He left the police department, in between fire department and police, and went off 2 years and went to Ireland. The stories after he commits suicide this past week or two ago, left out the trips to Ireland. They said he was in Ireland on his honeymoon, but they left out, they said he was in Alaska. But Ireland was a place set up by the IRA and the Vatican, the Knights of Malta, Otto Skorzeny. Skorzeny had approximately 78 castles in Ireland before he died, and he was the head of the whole Odessa network. And there could be many places for mind control. The story of Dan White is that he adored Ireland and read Irish books and wanted to be in Ireland. But the secret to Dan White is and always was, who did he see in Ireland and where did he stay? When there was a play in San Francisco on the story of Dan White, I tried to get the people involved there to question who he saw and where he was, because he came back then like a zombie, and he was a waiting killer that could kill at any time. In 1978, I said, upon his return to San Francisco, he met, after he came home from Ireland, his future wife, who recently returned from 4 years in Germany and 1 year in Japan. These are broadcast number 369. I asked what cities was White in on that broadcast. And when he got his passport, when did he leave the country? When did he come back? Was Jonestown an assassination zombie training place, as Terry Buford stated when the deaths took place? And was Dan White sent to Ireland for a couple of years, coming from the same city where Jim Jones operatives were, working with people from Stanford Research, one of the centers of mind control? How much relationship between Dan White's state of mind going to Ireland and the people from San Francisco being zonked out with drugs and tested for mind control down in Guyana? Now, broadcast 388, May the 11th, 1979, a little further in the year, or actually earlier, I was talking about the defense team for Dan White. They said, on the stand, he was too good for San Francisco. And this was part of his mind control. He was frustrated. Dan White shot and killed the mayor and the supervisor. He had trouble with his working class background and his belief that a man's word is his bond as against the reality of San Francisco politics. On the stand, his defense was, San Francisco is crummy. Those people don't keep their word. They said White's rigid values conflicted with everyday life, his strict Catholic upbringing, his experiences as a soldier in Vietnam, as a policeman, as against the real world. Now, the jury was mostly Catholic, and I went into the structure of the jury. I'll give you some of that in a minute. But the point was, his defense was he was too good for those cruddy people there. He was better than them. He kept his word. Now, on the jury, this was in May of 79, broadcast 390, I mentioned a Richard Aparicio. He was a member of the San Francisco police officers who was then retired. Mrs. Barbara Costuros, whose husband was the chef at the San Francisco jail and worked in the prison system, at the main jail in San Francisco. Nelson Bermudez, a printer for the Bank of America, and they have tremendous political clout in San Francisco, and people that objected to the conservatives, to the liberal type of activity and the anti-war activity of Harvey Milk. I'll go into that. It wasn't just that he was gay, but he did a lot of other street scene political activities. The foreman of the jury worked for Bechtel Corporation. Caspar Weinberger, our Secretary of Defense at the present time, worked with HEW, Health, Education, and Welfare, and during the Reagan administration in California was involved in mind control experiments, and was told to stop it by the late Sam Ervin. I've quoted this before. He came out of Bechtel Corporation, as did George Shultz, but Caspar Weinberger was directly linked to mind control experiments and to John Connolly and other experiments that I have detailed and can do again if you want them. And the jury was Catholic. So you had someone from the police department, from the San Francisco jail, the Bank of America, and Bechtel, and just about all Catholic jury. And they went on, his attorney, White and his attorney, used this defense that he had a strong sense of social responsibility. And after being elected to the Board of Supervisors, he saw the City Hall was rife with corruption, And he felt he was a hero. He didn't have to apologize for anything, and that's just the point. He never said, I'm sorry, because he knows they are bad. They're a different type of people. And what do you say you're sorry for? Martin Bormann never said he was sorry, and Joseph Mengele never said he was sorry, and Dan White never had to say he was sorry. And I quoted the jury, as they say, in May of '79. This is when the trial was going on. White was disillusioned with the manner in which politicians conducted themselves, and he was frustrated. Now, keep in mind that White was a failure in school. He went to college one semester, and they refer to being a veteran. But Dan White went to Vietnam for 1 year. He was a paratrooper. He comes home as a Vietnam paratrooper. There are various stories that he never saw any fighting. I don't know whether he was jumping out to deliver mail or what, but he was there exactly 1 year, and then he was sent to Fort Bragg, North Carolina, for 2 years. Now, that's where you could get mind control, sleepy killers, those sleeper killers. Remember James Frankenberry. I've talked about him before. James Frankenberry is a fellow who sent information that he was meeting with E. Howard Hunt, that's the partner of William Buckley, and that they were training for a shooting into General Walker's window, which would give Walker the chance to tell the people in Germany 2 days after the assassination of the communist Oswald shot him, and they were practicing for the crossfire of a motorcade. So Fort Bragg, where the special forces are, has schools for assassinations. They were training to kill the head of a foreign country and then realized that they were being trained there for domestic assassinations. In fact, Frankenberry had stated, James Frankenberry, that he saw people meeting with E. Howard Hunt. That's the partner of William Buckley, who formed Young Americans for Freedom. And so that the idea that he is better, Dan White is better than all these people, and he's a veteran, does not explain anything about his existences at Fort Bragg for 2 years, not in the battle, so he could be a wiper-outer. Now remember, from 1968, at least on paper, from 68 to 1974, at the time of Watergate and then the hearings to stop it, the United States government had the COINTEL program to break up the hippies, the gays. The United Prisoners Union in San Francisco was a city of covert counterintelligence, the rock music, people leaving home, coming to San Francisco. That was Operation Chaos. And in the middle of that comes Dan White, 1 year in Vietnam, and then to Fort Bragg, and then 2 years in Ireland, and meets a woman who's been in Japan, who now works, his wife, Mary Ann, works and did work for the Navy base, United States Army base at Treasure Island. When he killed himself that day, they took her from her teaching job, back to the house to meet what would be her tragedy. And she's at the Navy base, paid by the United States government, and is currently working there. So that this man with strong ideals, this is a script that the attorneys wrote or told him, and this was the brainwashing that you're too good for the city, you're too good for those people. He went to college and couldn't make it. He obviously couldn't handle Vietnam. They pulled him out for another job. He was at the fire department where his father worked. He left that. He was at the police department and took a leave of absence of that. He ran for the Board of Supervisors and stayed a short time and asked to get off of that. He opened a potato restaurant, baked potato, Pier 39, and then says, well, I don't have enough money. He went to Ireland and picked up 2 years vacation, or a short time in Ireland, even if it wasn't 2 years. And then when he gets out of Soledad prison, Dan White goes to Ireland again for a 4 months vacation. Now, the secret to Dan White, before he comes back to San Francisco, what was he doing in Ireland? Here's a family man who had one child, whose excuse for murdering 2 people, 2 politicians in San Francisco, 2 liberals, was that he couldn't live on the supervisor salary of $9,000. He had a home, she was working and had degrees, a teaching degree, and 1 child. So he fathers another child at Soledad Prison, conjugal visits. The child had Down syndrome, and then he has a 3rd child. If he's limited income and he's frustrated, why increase 2 times over? You're out of prison, or you're going to be out. The extra burden of extra children, and then he complained about not these people not being family people, I guess, taking jobs at the gays, not having families. And after he's in prison for 4.5 or 5 years, he takes off for 4 months and leaves a woman who just has a new baby, a baby with a Down syndrome, and a 7-year-old that would need his father anyway. So he's not a family man, and he lived in a separate place. He owned a home in San Francisco, and then he had another apartment, and the brother lived in by that garage where he commits suicide underneath the home. So they had separate housing, and he had the means to go to Ireland 4 months after he's out of prison, not be with his family at all, and come back, and then 2 months later just picks time to kill himself, and all of this coming down. And he's defending himself at the trial that the city isn't any good, that he's disillusioned with City Hall. Was he disillusioned with City Hall, or was the CIA and Washington, D.C. disillusioned with City Hall? He complained about vote trading that was contrary to his beliefs, and there's no reason to believe he had any beliefs at all. These are things I was talking about in 1979, so we can update them now in 1985 and just see what I was talking about then and how does it match up to what we see taking place today. And then the attorney said White lived by the golden rule. And on that broadcast in May of 79, I said the gold that bought the Porsche. He came home from Ireland, got himself a fancy Porsche, and then White, the defense of him of getting that light charge was he came to the defense of weaker children in school when there were fistfights. Well, why gun down people who don't have weapons in their hands, walk into the city hall and do that? And then I did another broadcast on Dan White, updating that, number 390. There's 390. You can get these back broadcasts and play them. I think, and they connect White to Jonestown too. And I think it's very important for you in understanding the work that I'm doing now to appreciate that 4 or 5 years from now you will see these things come together better. But what I'm giving you every week is a view of the past and connecting to the present and telling you where things are leading or the major characters that are making the moves. So I was very happy that Paul Bernardino called attention to the fact that he had tapes that are available to the San Francisco area if they want to understand what the Dan White story is about. Now, November the 1st, 1978, and I had this on the air in May of 79, Representative Leo Ryan sent a wire to Jim Jones, and he said, I'm coming down to Guyana. And November the 1st, 1978, Dan White resigned from the Board of Supervisors. Now, he was a former policeman funded by hidden patrons, and as soon as he got his charge and served his time in Soledad, he went on parole, and there was a $50,000 fund for Dan White. You remember that, just not long ago. And he was living part-time in Bel Air and not the loner they make him out to be. And I referred to his mysterious traveling years, and he was armed with fatal bullets. And so George Moscone is going to be hit shortly after that, 3 or 4 weeks later, by Dan White, who had resigned, and also Leo Ryan, head of the House Intelligence Committee, is going to go to Jonestown. So what you're going to get is Moscone, a liberal Democrat, killed in San Francisco, and Leo Ryan, a thorn in the CIA, trying to stop the CIA funds to Angola, which Ronald Reagan just officially escalated as being able to pour in now. He just was bringing out this week. So, and when Dan White confessed, November 27th, he went to the jail. You see, this was 27 days after he resigned, and just 9 days after Jonestown. He went to the police department, and this was in the San Francisco Chronicle, May the 4th, 1978. He said, some of these people have charged me with taking money from big corporations and not recording it, but I never did that. They were going to use me as a scapegoat. Whether or not I was a good supervisor or not was not the point. This was their political opportunity, and they were going to degrade me and hang me out to dry. And that's what Paul was talking about, that I said he was a zombie under mind control who got rid of Harvey Milk and got rid of Mayor George Moscone and turned the city from the center to the right, brought in the big builders, and he complained then that they were going to hang me out to dry. And I also, that was quite a long broadcast, an entire broadcast, number 390, if you want it, and it has to do with gay smashing and crashing heads and bar stools and broken ribs and carrying on in Castro Street, where the gays live in San Francisco, a great many of them do. of a lot of violence. There's a trial going on right now about gay bashing on Polk Street. 2 people that were murdered just this last year walking down the street because they were gays and had their heads cracked open. And the protection of the San Francisco police and law enforcement who allow these things to go on. The gay bashing was taking place then, and it is now. And then June the 1st, 1979, broadcast number 391, I asked the question, who owns Dan White? There was an article in the San Francisco Examiner, and they mentioned some of the corporations who had money inside of Dan White. I'll run those off for you. We'll take a 1-minute break and go back to those, and then some more on the mind control of Dan White and how this thing was achieved and how he was told to self-destruct at this time. It was important that he do it right now. I'll take, as I say, 1-minute break and come back to that and share that information with you. This is Mae Brussell. It's the second half of broadcast number 726, and I'm talking about the suicide of Dan White, the murder of Mayor George Moscone and Supervisor Harvey Milk in San Francisco. I was just quoting information I had from past broadcasts, number 369, 388, 390, and 391. If you want to order those broadcasts, send a self-addressed stamped envelope, and I'll give you information on how to get those tapes. I think they're very important, as I say, to go back that many years and then look at the news now and study the articles and the history about San Francisco to see how, as William Buckley says, the assassination is very necessary and is changing the fabric of American democracy. Now, in the article in the San Francisco Examiner, who owns Dan White, there's an article, The Selling of Dan White, and it goes into the people downtown who gave him money and put money on him that were not for Mayor Moscone and Harvey Milk. And just some of the supporters were Warren Simmons, the man who owned a big developer who owned Pier 39, where Dan White was renting his little potato restaurant, Gary Vanelli from Pier 39, Robert Warehouse, a Simmons employee at 39, Crown Zellebacker, Citizen Savings and Loan Bank and the Redwood Bank, the Emporium, the large retail chain similar to Macy's, and also Macy's was supporting him, and Foremost McKesson, the large dairy in San Francisco, Bechtel Corporation with their links to the CIA, the Department of Defense, Pentagon, and as I say, the foreman for the jury worked for Bechtel, Standard Oil of California, and the law office of Pillsbury, Madison, and Citro that represent the Rockefeller and Standard Oil, the billboard industry, Foster Kleiser, the Eller Outdoor Advertising, Girardelli Square, the largest resort area in the San Francisco for visitors, large shopping center, Embarcadero Center, Cyril Magnin, retired, formerly owner Joseph Magnin, and he spoke up on behalf of Jim Jones. That happens to be my father's first cousin, nothing to do with me. I hardly ever, if possible, see Cyril. He spoke up in favor of Jim Jones and tried to stop a New West magazine expose on Jim Jones. And Mr. Cyril Magnin, it was Mr. San Francisco. He represents all the visiting dignitaries and so forth that come to San Francisco. And Bob Lurie, owner of the San Francisco Giants. I don't want to run over too much more because those tapes are available. That's a view of the past of Dan White. Now, Dan White served a lot of purposes. He was a time bomb. The clue to his self-destruction possibly came in a magazine that is printed in the Bay Area that's very important to San Francisco called Focus Magazine. It comes out to the intellectual elite and so forth. It's the listener public supported station. Up here it's channel 9 KQED, and it plays in other cities different channel numbers. Their new magazine this month has a picture of Harvey Milk in there, and they're going to show the times of Harvey Milk. That was the Academy Award documentary last year. And here's Dan White living in the city of San Francisco, and his magazine just came out this week, the same week that Harvey Milk's killer, Dan White, commits suicide. They are going to put on the picture 2 times of Harvey Milk. Incidentally, I recommend for people to see it. If you don't have a video recorder, tape the sounds and voice. It's a very interesting movie. I saw it in New York last March and happened to be at the theater the night when he came out. They said this movie just won the Academy Award. But it reminded me of John Hinckley, the week that he shot Ronald Reagan, another mind-controlled job. That Newsweek had a picture of Jodie Foster for no reason. She's at Yale University, and a lot of kids at Yale who want to be actors and actresses, and those who already are, don't have their picture in Newsweek all the time. But there was a photograph of Jodie Foster the same week that came out prior to John Hinckley shooting the president and shooting off the brains, literally killing his brains, of Mr. Brady, the press secretary, and several of the security guards about Ronald Reagan. Now, the excuse for the acquittal for murder charges, but he's just kept in a mental hospital, are for Hinckley that he had a love for Jodie Foster, and her picture just coincidentally came out at that time. And Dan White kills himself just at the time that Focus magazine announces that the subject of Harvey Milk is going to be played 2 times, at least in the Bay Area, and everybody will get a chance to see it. And Dan White gets a lesser charge, and he's out in 4.5 to 5 years after he kills 2 public officials in the City Hall of San Francisco on a defense that sugar content makes him crazy. And that's the famous Twinkies defense. And while he was in prison, he not only showed no remorse, but he had no psychiatric counseling. Nobody could unwind his mind, and I want to get to that. And he kept on eating all the sugar he wanted. So 2 very political people, as William Buckley knows, John Hinckley, who, if he had shot the president and killed him, we would have George Bush, former director of the CIA, as the president, and then the great Alexander Haig, the vicar of Washington, the Knight of Malta, who said, "I am in charge," of Malta, along with Buckley and various characters I mentioned before. Haig would have been prominent in the White House just at the time, 2 months prior to when the Pope was going to be shot, and Haig was part of that conspiracy with Michael Ledeen to blame the Soviet Union for the shooting of the Pope, trying to tie it to Ajah. So Haig was tied to the Ajah Ledeen story. He was standing up in the front mic. But John Hinckley is now in a mental hospital, St. Elizabeth, where he has announced his intentions to marry a woman who's there for murdering her child. And Dan White, just coincidentally, was allowed his conjugal visit and gave birth to a deformed child. One is locked up for killing her child. The other one gave birth to a deformed child. Both of them got off. One wasn't even charged with murder. Hinckley was charged and acquitted, and Dan White got the lesser charges. And I believe that White and Hinckley, of course, were mind control zombies. So in the next 2 weeks, or if it comes to your hometown, be sure to see the movie of Harvey Milk. Now, the important thing about the Harvey Milk movie is that Milk is not only a gay activist, and there's a lot of emphasis put on the fact that he was shot because he was gay, that Dan White shot the mayor, then loaded the gun, walked past Dianne Feinstein's office, and then shot Harvey Milk because he grinned at him. Supposedly because he grinned at him. But Harvey Milk was doing something that the COINTEL program wanted and Operation Chaos wanted, that the government had put in operation from the Pentagon and the Defense and the CIA and the FBI, and that was to break up disparate groups. The purpose of the COINTEL and Operation Chaos was to break up various groups of the blacks, the prisoners, the Black Panthers, the Chicanos, the Venceremos, and the lesbians, homosexuals. And what Harvey Milk was doing, very prominent in San Francisco, was that he was working with the anti-war movement, and he was collecting all these separate groups that if they ever got their heads together, they could overthrow the power structure. And that's why the power structure has to keep killing their leaders and breaking them apart, putting wedges between the groups. And Harvey Milk was a born leader, a great personality at a camera store in Castro Street. When you see the movie, you realize that the anti-war thing was as much into the mind of this Dan White having his year in Vietnam, then 2 years of goodness knows what. There's nothing about what he did at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, so that hitting Harvey Milk was as much for his anti-war activities in San Francisco, for his combining the disparate groups, and for being a gay supervisor. See, when he was replaced after Harvey Milk was killed, another gay, Mr. Britt, took his place, and on the board of supervisors, if to say, well, he wasn't killed because he was gay, because here's one gay for another. But you lose the person with the charisma, you lose the person who's organizing all the various groups and making a voting bloc, and the proof is that Ronald Reagan can take 49 states because all these disparate groups who combined are more powerful than the few that control are not combined. And that's the story behind this. Now, November the 18th, 1978, the Jonestown murder took place. And this isn't a broadcast about Jonestown. I'll do more on that later. But over 900 people were killed, and Jonestown was set up. And out of Stanford research and Tim Stone and Dr. Godlet and people from San Francisco and money from England and so forth set up the Jonestown. But out of that, there were 1,200 passports Jim Jones had on the desk, and several hundred of those people walked away. They didn't walk away, they sailed away on Jim Jones' boats. So there were at least 140 people, at least, not accounted for, who had the bodies turned face down, who administered poison, who shot those who didn't take the poison, who have been tightly protected by the Central Intelligence Agency, the State Department, the Justice Department, ever since 1978, these mass murders that were called suicide, and 50% of them were murders. The bodies were left to rot so they wouldn't be identified. So somebody knows, a lot of people know in Washington, why the identification names were taken off, why the papers are locked up and never made public. And this was on November 18th, 1978. And Jim Jones was a part of San Francisco politics. He helped George Moscone get elected. He was appointed to a housing commission job, and there were prominent blacks and whites in San Francisco politics, which is against those corporations that I named before. They found a common denominator between different disparate elements, and Jim Jones was part of City Hall in San Francisco, and Dan White was part of City Hall. And then November 27th, 1978, 9 days after Jonestown, this fellow, Dan White, from the police, from the fire department, from his trips in Ireland, with his wife from Germany, who's trained in Germany and Japan, who works for the United States Navy now and has while he was in prison, he knocks down the liberal mayor and the supervisor, who happens to be gay but happens to be an organizer at the same time. Now, the San Francisco Police Department were of a mind of Dan White. He got his encouragement by them. He was told it was the right thing. Again, that's why he didn't apologize. And the San Francisco Police Department not only wore T-shirts, "Free Dan White," but they helped him every way. They didn't grab him when he left the city hall. They let him go to the church. They let him telephone his wife from the doggy diner. They all knew who killed these two men in City Hall, so don't tell me he had time to go pray at a church. What they did was they gave that church image. His wife, Mary Ann, quickly runs over to meet him. No traffic, you understand, in San Francisco. No policeman handcuffed Dan White and took him in looking like a prisoner or a killer. You never saw that. He goes with his little sweetie wife, working for the Navy, and they go to the church to show that they're religious, as against those heathen, those people over in Castro Street, or those crazy church people down in Guyana, that they're good, they're Christian, they're Catholics. And then they walk in and turn themselves into his best friend, gives him a telephone in the cell and so forth, and special food and treatment. But the San Francisco Police Department, where today they have swastikas and symbols of Nazi Germany, as do the prisons, and they helped also to train certain people at Jonestown and to shoot certain people at Jonestown. And the shooters are out, over 140 of them, never seen, never accounted for, or the boats accounted for that they escaped on. So what you have in San Francisco are members of the police department strongly linked to Jonestown, and you have Dan White, part of the police department, and a Mayor Moscone who's linked to Jones, and they're going to wipe out the mayor and the supervisor, but the guy who does it is told, just like Jack Ruby was told, that he's a hero for cleaning up this mess there. Jack Ruby was going to settle the Dallas assassination by killing Lee Harvey Oswald, then they wouldn't have to have a miserable trial. Well, if Oswald was alone and there was no conspiracy, he would have done Dallas a favor, because if Oswald was charged just for killing Kennedy for reasons the Warren Commission cooked up, then the city would clear itself of being a part of a cover-up or a conspiracy. So Dan White had an important role in a city that had a lot of violence, and before it there was a lot of violence and chaos. And the sympathy of the establishment, the conservative elite, was always with Dan White, and they let him out to dry. Now, that movie, The Times of Harvey Milk, was made by a gentleman by the name of Robert Epstein. And he had an interview in the San Jose Mercury about this movie, and he tells about in 1978 how Senator John Briggs was pushing a proposition in the California Senate, Proposition 6, to stop homosexuals from being teachers. And Dan White was very active in San Francisco to get that bill stopped, and he campaigned, and he was a real leader. In the movie shows he was a leader. And the fellow who made this movie, Robert Epstein, says the problem he was trying to show was American values were in conflict. Now, American values were in conflict, just as William Buckley said, but they're going to go farther right now. They're not going to go back to where they were. Every time you get a political assassination, it's never done for a purpose to make things more left. There's no communists or leftists killing the right wing so that we get liberal policies. No liberal ever replaced a conservative after an assassination. But every murder that I cited in the beginning out of Buckley's article and book made something go farther right. So Robert Epstein is asking the question, how do conflicts get resolved in our society? And he talks about Dan White, the hardworking, the conservative, the American boy, the family man, as against Harvey Milk, the all-American boy who won the system, won the elections, and was proud and holds up his hand after his victory in the camera store the night when he went in as a supervisor and when he defeated Proposition 6. And he says Harvey Milk believed in change. And then Mr. Epstein said White couldn't cope with change. His inability to accept change is what led him to kill. That he himself couldn't accept change. And he says, in the San Jose Mercury, I'm quoting the article, he said, the world doesn't stand still. We all have choices about achieving and accepting changes in our personal lives and in society. Harvey Milk's way was to communicate and interact, and he was happy and joking, and Dan White was different, and his actions speak for himself. And then the article goes on that Dan White set back San Francisco progressive direction for countless years to come, and he deprived the gay community of a potential national leader, something so needed in the age of AIDS. Now, that's exactly what Dan White was doing, but it isn't Dan White's tragedy. It's what he was selected to do. He came out of a family mixed with the fire, the police department, the San Francisco establishment. And the point that Robert Epstein is missing is that the jovial attitude, the positiveness of Harvey Milk was just a temporary thing, that Harvey Milk, in my interpretation, was not in contact with society as are all the Democratic and the black and the gay and the anti-nuclear people today. The trouble with Epstein and those people is that we are left poor. The minorities are worse off. The gays, the blacks, the Chicanos, and Jews are going to get things harder because decisions in this country are met by the bullet. And until you recognize that, wherever Harvey Milk was and George Moscone, when John Kennedy had his head blown off, if they didn't care about that particular murder, with all the literature, with all the people speaking up, goodness knows there was a lot of opportunity. I've been on the air since 1971, and in San Francisco in 72, I was flooding the airwaves in their city on the Watergate connections to Nazis, to the John Kennedy assassination, and so forth. Never a response from them, their aides, supervisors, or anybody else. And as I say, on the anniversary of Kennedy's assassination, what I want to say, and I've said it before, and it bears repetition often, is that only, and only when people recognize their past can they ever account for the present or figure out the future. Only. That Harvey Milk was a political activist. He wasn't interested in who killed John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, Medgar Evers. I could name 20 others, but those affected America the most. He thought, I have a camera store. People like me. I'm dedicated. Look, we're underdogs. I'm gay. You're black. You're Chinese. Let's get it together. That is one way to do it, get it together. But at the same time, you have to know that if you don't go into who killed John, then you haven't got a chance to live either. Because if you can take a man who's the President of the United States and blow his head off in Dallas in full sight, and have a man like Dan Rather tell you the head went forward when the head went backward, and lie about the bullet direction, and Dan Rather heads the news on CBS. When you get outright lies like that, and you accept that, the Zapruder film has flooded San Francisco, they didn't care. Once you open up the wounds of political assassinations, then people can get together, not before. The anti-nuclear can fight nuclear bombs, and then comes Daniel Graham and Fritz Kramer and Edward Teller and say, yeah, you're right. You don't want atomic bombs. We'll have a protective Star Wars defensive over you with laser weapons. You're right. You don't want that. Let's do it a different way. The world doesn't stand still. That's what Robert Epstein said. He's correct. But it doesn't stand still and goes forward. And if you don't believe it, read your morning papers. Read what's happening to the farmers, to the banks, to the water, to your food, the agribusiness. Read what's going on in the world in terms of medicine. I just read the government hospitals, the federal hospitals for veterans and so forth, they're saddled with like $32 million of lawsuits for malpractice, and the prison system's lawsuits, overcrowding, and malpractice medical there. But besides the medical care of the prisoners, just take, as I say, your banks and your farms and your food and your homes and the cost of inflation of various things happening to you and your own insecurities, your government without enough money to write its paychecks this next week, having to hold back paychecks because there's no money to write their checks. Things don't stand still, Mr. Epstein. They get worse. And as John Dean said to Richard Nixon, there's a cancer on the presidency. There is a cancer in this society killing off all these kinds of people. We don't have choices about achieving and accepting changes in our personal lives. Epstein says we all have choices about achieving and accepting changes in our personal lives and in society. There's some things you don't have choices about any more than you have choices about not getting cavities or losing your teeth and not brushing your teeth. When you get up, if you want to brush your teeth and save your teeth, you floss and brush and take care of them. Otherwise, those teeth fall out. Some things you don't take choices about. And the killing of our public leaders or the rock musicians in the Bay Area and the directors and producers, and now the creation of AIDS. I did a half-hour broadcast on AIDS, and also, maybe you saw from the Soviet Union this week, allegations that AIDS is man-made by the United States biological warfare, and I'll do more next week. The only people, and I'm going to say this, I've said it before, but I'm really harsh about this now, the only people today who have real choices are basically white, they're Anglo-Saxon, they're Protestant or Catholic, not the cult people, they don't have choices. They have prearranged nursery schools, prep schools, colleges. There's radio broadcasts now about selecting colleges when your child is in grammar school. They have built-in systems and always had that exclude all those things that Harvey Milk identified with from the society and the power structure creates in their laboratory, like Frankenstein, a Dan White, to make sure that these people keep their choices down. And this is why you have so many street people and bag ladies and so forth. Dan White didn't set back San Francisco's progressive direction. This is what Mr. Epstein says regarding his movie on Harvey Milk. He says Dan White didn't set it back, but what what he said was by killing Harvey Milk, he set back the progressive direction. That isn't true. San Francisco set it back themselves, not Dan White. They never investigated the Dan White case, even the people that wrote the plays on him. They never went into the trips of Dan White. Dan White got a telephone call in the morning. He doesn't drive his own car, Mr. Macho family man, to work. A woman picks him up. He climbs through a window, and nobody checked that window. If the City Hall pays people to guard weapons as you come through the door, then City Hall must know that the windows on the ground floor are closed. So a conspiracy is two or more doing an illegal thing, and Dan White knew when he got a telephone call to put a gun in his pocket, to take extra bullets to reload, and to go through a particular window and go right in. It was a split second. He didn't look around for a window. He didn't send someone in to open a window, or did he? And if he did, then that person knew that he couldn't come through like everyone else because the weapon would make a zing where the guard is. His trips to Ireland before he was married, he went there on his honeymoon. he was there before, and particularly the 4 months before the murder. Those trips to Ireland are important. The $50,000 fund he got for them to live off while he was in jail, who and why put that up? His 2 years in North Carolina at Fort Bragg, what happened there? And the zombie trance that he never got out of. Now, if a man is put in prison and he's given, say, 7 years, which Dan got, and he got 2 off light, if he has no psychological training, and if he still eats those sugars that he did before, and no psychiatrist can break the trance, then he shouldn't be paroled. I read recently that somebody wanted parole from Vacaville or Folsom, and they wouldn't give it to him because he refused psychiatric training. Now, if the defense of Dan White was psychiatric, and he refuses to be helped psychiatrically, then you know, of course, he'd go down Castro Street and kill a whole bunch of gays, but in this case, he had to end it, according to them, and end the control and kill himself. Now, there are lots of books on mind control, a lot of places in California where mind control zombies are created. Candy Jones came from New York and had to go to Oakland for her mind control, her sodium pentothal that gave her 2 personalities. So the people in San Francisco have heard many radio talk shows on books like Operation Mind Control, The Control of Candy Jones, and so forth. So why haven't they gone into these things? These are the people that have set San Francisco back, not just the shooting of Harvey Milk. That isn't what did it. Now, several weeks ago or a month ago, I was reading part of a manuscript or a description of a person from the Aryan nations, from the National Socialist Party. It's a technicality which name they want to use, whether it's the Identity or the National Socialist. And this is a fellow who lives in Salinas, and I quoted his appreciation for Adolf Hitler. And in his description, he's like Dan White describing White's personality: dogged, stubbornness, mission-oriented, arrogant, belligerent, and his great affection for Adolf Hitler. And I had this on a broadcast, his ability to serve the cause of Adolf Hitler, and also his political achievements were described. And this isn't a book of fiction. This is the Fuhrer of California describing his achievements. A unit member in El Monte, California, with the Nazi Party from April 1966 until he was transferred to the San Francisco unit by Commander Cole after his return in Germany in 1975. Now, we're talking about the streets of San Francisco in 1975, when Dan White was working for the police department and then went to Ireland and came back. The member of the Nazi Party was an officer in February 75 to April 76 in San Francisco. He was a leader of the Nazi Party unit, April 76 to November 78. Now, he was a district leader of the Northern California District, November 78 to September 80. Now, April 76 to 78 was the time of the zebra, the pattyhurst, but this is when the gay bashing was going on. November 78 was when Dan White killed Milk and Moscone. It was when Jim Jones and the people of Jonestown were wiped out. A real Nazi mind control program. And this fellow describes his National Socialist Award promotion to Stormtrooper, Team Leader, and Group Leader, and a Socialist Wound Award for severe injuries received during a major street battle September 26, 1977, in the streets of San Francisco, and an Adolf Hitler 10-year service medal and Hitler's leadership medal. Now, the question was, if the network of the Nazis that is national and then international, tied into Manfred Roeder and the late Otto Skorzeny, who set this up, and Mr. Erlanger in Buffalo, and Hans Ulrich Rudel from Hitler's Luftwaffe, and connections to Nazis in South America and Germany and up in Idaho and down to Lockheed. These connections involve people from Lockheed, from the Boeing aircraft, from the Air Force, and from United Technology. And this fellow is talking about his awards and injuries. What happened September 26th? Somebody in San Francisco gets these tapes. Look up the police records of Nazi stormtroopers in 77 and see if Harvey Milk was confronting American stormtroopers then. And then Dan White, through this whole time period, as I say, he comes home from Vietnam and he's in San Francisco in the police department, and then he's in Ireland, he's at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. So in San Francisco on the street, you have Commander Cole from the Nazi Party. You have this leader, the future Fuhrer, who's arrived from Germany. You have Mary Ann, who not only works for our Navy, Mary Ann White, but who had 4 years in Germany. Did these people know each other in Germany? See, these are the connections that are the true story of Dan White. I don't have time to do all the mind control, but I'll do some of that next week and go into that in detail and do part 2 of this particular series on Dan White, because the streets of San Francisco had plenty of violence and Nazis there, and Dan White thought he could survive as a member of the supervisors, and the liberal Mayor George Moscone thought he had it made. And in comes this mysterious person with all these trips and experiences who wipes them out. Now, Francis Moriarty, a Catholic priest who covered the Dan White trial, wrote an article in the San Jose Mercury saying White made no confessions during the trial or after or before. He made self-serving justifications. He didn't have the slightest hint on his tapes he made or letters he left, suicide letters for them, that he ever examined his conscience. Well, if you think of Dan White as a neo-Nazi who'd get the lethal stormtroopers award, what conscience? The priest, Mr. Moriarty, says it wasn't a morsel of sorrow. He thinks of himself as a hero. The absence of contrition. He never showed a detest for his sins. After his release, he was pretty cocky. He never admitted anything wrong. Well, why should he? He came out of a milieu where he was told he was doing the right thing, and what Dan White represents is America. Moscone and Milk don't represent what America is. These men represent what the power structure thinks America is. And that's the problem with solving the Dan White or the San Francisco situation. The time is out now. I'll do more next week on the mind control of Dan White, because this went pretty fast and I didn't have time to go into that. But the social milieu of Harvey Milk and George Moscone and Dan White is very important, because Dan White represented the establishment from the time he was active in the Army as a paratrooper until the day he killed himself. He was proud of what he did, and the powers that be did let him down, and the only thing he could do then is self-destruct, as the CIA tells its agents to do when they're no longer usable. They self-destruct. I'll be back next week to continue some more of this and update last week's broadcast for you and go back over some of the details of 725. In the meanwhile, this is Mae Brussell, and I'll share some more of this information, and thank you again for books and articles that are literally flooding my house, but I love it. Take care and goodbye.